Welcome to the third part of my debunking of the testimony of Don Easterbrook to a Senate committee. In this part, he tries to show that carbon dioxide has nothing to do with global warming. He starts off his campaign by making several definitive statements that are frankly crazy. He says carbon dioxide, makes up just 39 1,000th of 1% of the atmosphere. That is as close to nothing as you can get. You can triple that and still have nothing. There is not enough CO2 in the atmosphere to do much of anything. CO2 only accounts for 3.6% of greenhouse effect, which he later changes to 3%. CO2 by itself is incapable of causing global warming. He repeats that several times. Let me show you why the percent of the atmosphere that's carbon dioxide does not matter. Let's start with the volume of gas that is completely transparent to the light that we're discussing, infrared. Say we put 100 photons of infrared light into this volume of gas. As it's transparent, we'll get 100 photons out the far end. Now let's repeat that experiment with a gas that absorbs infrared like carbon dioxide. So here's exactly the same volume of gas that is now carbon dioxide. So we put 100 infrared photons in one end and say we only get 50 photons out the other end. Now note, in both these cases, the amount of gas in the atmosphere is 100%. So in the first case we have 100% of the gas that is transparent, it makes no difference. And in the second case we have 100% of an absorbing gas like carbon dioxide, and that absorbs about half of the radiation as it passes through. So now let's mix the two. So you have exactly the same number of molecules of the first and second case, but now combined. So what happens when you put 100 photons of infrared radiation in one end? Well, the transparent gas makes no difference whatsoever, and the photons are encountering the same amount of absorbing gas as they did before, so you'd still get 50% of the radiation out the far end. But now the percentage of the atmosphere that is carbon dioxide is only 50%, not 100%, yet you're getting the same effect. So let's do another experiment. Let's double the amount of the transparent gas. So now we have twice the number of transparent gas molecules as we had before, but the same number of carbon dioxide molecules that we had before. So we put our 100 photons in at one end. Again, the transparent gas molecules make no difference whatsoever. Those 100 photons encounter exactly the same number of carbon dioxide atoms as they did before, and so you get 50 photons out the other end. But now you have the carbon dioxide only making up 33% of the atmosphere. So there is no difference between carbon dioxide making up 100% of the atmosphere, 50% of the atmosphere, or 33% of the atmosphere. All that matters is the number of carbon dioxide molecules that the infrared photons hit as they're going through this volume of gas. So it means that the partial pressure of the gas matters, not the percentage of the gas that's in the atmosphere. Now if we say doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in that same volume of gas in our second experiment, you would be halving the probability that the photons get through uncontaminated. So instead of getting 50 at the other end, you'd get 25. And if you keep on increasing the number of carbon dioxide atoms in the atmosphere, you go from an Earth with an average temperature of 16 degrees centigrade to Venus with an average surface temperature of 462 degrees centigrade. Now Mr. Easterbrook seems to start employing new math. He correctly claims that 3 times nothing is nothing, but I think most of us know that already. However, 390 parts per million is not nothing. It's a finite quantity. No finite quantity equals 0. If you triple that finite quantity, you still don't get 0. You get another finite quantity. He keeps on claiming that this is about as close to 0 as you can get. So 390 parts per million is not as close to 0 as you can get. You could have 390 parts per billion, or 1 part per billion, or 1 part per trillion. And that's a lot closer to 0 than 390 parts per million. So that's just a piece of mathematical nonsense and theatre. Then he says, since 1950, the increase in carbon dioxide is only 0.81 Now remember, we're not dealing with percentage of the atmosphere, we're dealing with percentage of carbon dioxide. So what's the increase in the percentage of carbon dioxide since the 1950s? In 1950, the concentration was 310 parts per million. Is now 300. In 2013, it's 390 parts per million. So you take 310 from 390, divide it by 310. That's a 26% increase, and that increase since 1800, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, is nearly 50%. So he's just fiddling the numbers to try to make his case rather than actually showing the truth. As far as the greenhouse gases having no significant effect on the planet's temperature, if we didn't have them, we would be living on an ice planet. The average temperature of the Earth is about 16 degrees centigrade. Let's compare that with the Moon that doesn't have an atmosphere but is at the same distance from the Sun, and the average temperature there is minus 16 degrees centigrade. So the presence of our atmosphere is making a difference of 32 degrees centigrade. The temperature change between an ice age and an interglacial like we are in now is between 4 and 8 degrees centigrade. While humans have existed, we've never been in territory where the temperature is 4 degrees centigrade warmer than the current interglacial. So that we are actually tampering with our planet to an extent that we ourselves and our civilization have not survived before. We've survived ice ages, we've not survived very warm periods. Unfortunately for him, he keeps on touting water vapor, but unfortunately water vapor only plays a secondary role. It does play a major role in that about 50%, not 95%, of the greenhouse effect is water vapor, but it depends solely on temperature. So in effect what it does is it magnifies any changes in the temperature caused by other effects. There's also the effect of clouds, which also could be argued to be water vapor, but even combined they only make up 75% of the greenhouse effect, and the other 25% is mostly carbon dioxide. So his figures are way out. Now, this is only the greenhouse effect. One should talk about clouds a little bit more because they actually have a negative effect as well. They warm by keeping heat in, but they also reflect away sunlight, keeping heat out, i.e. they increase the Earth's albedo. And the net effect of the two is actually very small. In fact, a lot of people cannot decide whether it's a net positive, i.e. warming effect, or a net cooling effect. He then makes this big deal about how water vapor in the air is decreasing and that this invalidates all the climate models. There is less water vapor in the atmosphere since 1947, he says, and then shows this plot, which indeed shows, at least for the upper two plots, that the water vapor in the atmosphere is dropping. Those are at high altitudes, by the way. That's respectively 9 and 3 kilometers. But at the bottom you should see the surface, and basically it's hard to tell a trend up or down in that particular data. But there is a slight problem with this plot, and it's hard to see, so I've blown it up. It's this bit here. It says atmospheric relative humidity at 100 millibars. That's the surface. Now, relative humidity is the amount of water in the air compared to the amount of water that would saturate that air. Now, as temperature goes up, the amount of water taken to saturate the air increases. So therefore, without anything else changing, as temperature goes up, you would expect the relative humidity to drop. And that's what you're seeing. So effectively, he's showing by this plot that global warming is occurring. So relative humidity is irrelevant. What we really need is absolute or specific humidity, which is the mass of water in the air for a given volume of air. He should have shown this plot, and again I've chosen a plot that would have been available to him for his presentation, so by not showing it he's just being purely negligent, and this shows a distinct trend in the amount of water in the atmosphere over the last 40 years. So atmospheric water vapor is increasing, and so his criticism of the models is improper. Next, he indulges in some superficial thinking, returning to an old canard about how saturated carbon dioxide is. He says, the CO2 in the atmosphere right now is mostly saturated. The maximum increase in temperature from adding more CO2 is about 0.1 degrees centigrade. This is basic physics, he avers. Really? Let's take a look at some basic physics. Here's the absorption bands in the infrared part of the spectrum that is important to cooling our planet. And indeed you can see that in carbon dioxide 3 of the bands are saturated, but not all of the bands. So his argument, if true, would work for carbon dioxide, at least for some of it. But by the same argument, you see that water vapor is saturated in the atmosphere. So according to him, water vapor makes no difference either. The problem is that this argument only is true at the surface of the Earth. As you go higher, this argument breaks down. Let's take a look at the battle between water vapor and carbon dioxide. Water vapor seems to win at low altitudes. Carbon dioxide wins at high altitudes. First of all, the higher the temperature, the higher the humidity. At the average temperature of the Earth, the atmosphere can hold at about most 2% by mass of the air being water vapor. But if you go down to freezing point, the air can hold only about a quarter of that water vapor, but it still has the same amount of carbon dioxide. And if you go down to very low temperatures, you can go to levels of water vapor that are equivalent to those of carbon dioxide. Also, the higher you go in altitude, the lower the temperature. So as you go up, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere drops. The influence of water vapor in the atmosphere declines with altitude. So above 2 to 4 kilometers, its effect is almost zero. As you go higher, though, carbon dioxide becomes less and less saturated with altitude until you get to a pressure of 160 millibars. And then you can see in this plot that the carbon dioxide line is not saturated. So the increase of altitude shows an increasing influence of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are not frozen out. Let me show how it really works. It's not the lower levels of the atmosphere where the water vapor and the carbon dioxide are saturated. It's the upper levels. It's the level at which the infrared photons, the heat from the Earth, can escape into space and cool the Earth. The longer these photons stay in the Earth's atmosphere, and the higher they have to go in order to escape, the warmer the Earth will get. Let's illustrate that. An IR photon travels about 70 meters before hitting a carbon dioxide molecule at the surface. That's called its mean free path. But as it goes higher, that mean free path gets longer and longer. Eventually, it will become infinite, i.e. it will escape into deep space, cooling the Earth. But because when it encounters a carbon dioxide molecule or any other greenhouse gas molecule, it gets bounced around. It can be scattered forward, sideways, or back down again. So, to try to escape the atmosphere, an infrared photon may well describe a path rather like the one shown here, where it bounces around, it goes up, down, but sideways all the time. Eventually, it will pass the altitude where water vapor is frozen out. That's 2 to 4 kilometers. And so the effect above here will be primarily the greenhouse gases, and then primarily of those, carbon dioxide. Eventually it will reach an altitude which is equivalent to 160 millibars, where the carbon dioxide is no longer saturated, and it will enable it to escape to space, and that altitude is between 12 and 15 kilometers. So the effect of adding more CO2 increases the number of steps it has to take and the altitude of it to escape. That creates increased warming. Now we have to deal with yet more silliness. He says there's no correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature. Well, really? Let's take a look at that. Here's a simple plot of the carbon dioxide concentration as a function of time compared to global temperatures. And you can see there is a very good correlation. Now this was again available in 2013, but let's add what's happened in the last few years. From this time we've gone above 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and I've added crudely what has happened to global temperatures in the meantime. And you can see the correlation continues. CO2 is the result of global warming, not the cause. He claims as temperatures go up, carbon dioxide increases as more is given up by the oceans. This data is available to him. You can see in the purple curve here that carbon dioxide has been steadily increasing. That's the so-called Keeling curve. In the dark blue here, you can see the amount of carbon dioxide that's been dissolved in seawater. That is going up. By his model, that should be going down. So he knows full well that the oceans are not giving up carbon dioxide, they're actually absorbing it. Thank goodness they are, otherwise it would be even hotter. And as a result of absorbing that carbon dioxide, the pH of the seawater is dropping, i.e. it's becoming more acidic. So he is completely and utterly wrong on this, and he knows he's wrong. These measurements are available to him and he knows about them. So this is a pure deception. Here endeth our third lesson. He keeps appealing to, quote, basic physics or simple physics, yet he shows no understanding of it. Either he is a poor physicist or he's a deceptive one. You decide. Thank you for listening. More next time.